Rachel had always believed in being a good neighbor. When she moved into her new two-story colonial house in suburban Connecticut, she made an effort to introduce herself to everyone on Maple Street. Most neighbors were friendly but busy, offering polite waves and brief conversations. But Eleanor was different. Eleanor lived in the identical colonial across from Rachel's, a house frozen in time from the 1950s. She was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair always perfectly styled. From the moment Rachel moved in, Eleanor had been exceptionally welcoming. "You simply must come for dinner tomorrow evening," Eleanor had said during their first conversation. "I make wonderful pot roast, and it's been so long since I've had someone to cook for." Rachel accepted the invitation, grateful for such a warm neighbor. But what she didn't know was that Eleanor had been waiting 3 years for someone exactly like her to move into that house. The first dinner had been lovely. Eleanor's house was immaculately decorated with antique furniture and family photographs spanning decades. The pot roast was delicious, and Eleanor shared stories about the neighborhood's history. "You remind me so much of my daughter, Margaret," Eleanor said as they finished dessert. "She had your same laugh, your same way of tilting her head when she listened." When Rachel asked about Margaret, Eleanor's expression shifted. "She passed away 5 years ago. Car accident? She was 32, just like you." The invitations kept coming. Almost every evening, Eleanor appeared at Rachel's door with fresh dinner invitations. When Rachel started making excuses, Eleanor didn't seem to understand the word no. "But I've already prepared your favorite meal," Eleanor would say. "The pot roast you loved so much." The problem was, Rachel had never said pot roast was her favorite, and Eleanor seemed to know things about Rachel's schedule that she shouldn't know. "How did you know I had a conference call this morning?" Rachel asked during one awkward conversation. "Oh, I saw you pacing in your home office," Eleanor replied casually. "You always pace when you're nervous," just like Margaret used to do. Rachel's home office was on the second floor with curtains always closed. There was no way Eleanor could have seen her pacing unless she was watching with binoculars. That night, Rachel tested her suspicions. Standing in her darkened living room, she looked across at Eleanor's house. She could see a figure silhouetted in Eleanor's upstairs window, clearly watching through what appeared to be a telescope. The next evening, Rachel accepted Eleanor's dinner invitation, but with a plan. While Eleanor checked on dinner, Rachel quietly explored the first floor. What she found made her blood run cold. Every photograph in Eleanor's living room was actually of Rachel. Pictures of her leaving for work, coming home from shopping, working in her garden, even sleeping with curtains open. Some photos appeared taken weeks before Rachel had even moved to the neighborhood. Most disturbing was the shrine Eleanor had created in her dining room. The table was set for 2, but one place setting contained items that clearly belonged to Rachel. Her missing coffee mug, a lost scarf, even earrings she couldn't find after moving. On the mantelpiece were dozens of candles surrounding a framed photograph, not of Eleanor's daughter Margaret, but of Rachel. "I see you found Margaret's shrine," Eleanor said softly from the doorway. Rachel spun around. Eleanor stood there with a carving knife, her expression eerily calm. "I'm not Margaret," Rachel said, backing toward the window. "Of course you are," Eleanor replied, stepping closer. "You have her laugh, her hair color, her way of moving. You even live in her house now. The house where she grew up before she moved away and forgot about her mother." Rachel realized Eleanor genuinely believed she was her dead daughter. The older woman had been watching Rachel's house because she thought Margaret had come home. "Margaret, you've been so cruel, avoiding your mother's dinner invitations," Eleanor continued, raising the knife. "But now you're here, and we can finally have our family dinner." Rachel grabbed a heavy candlestick and struck Eleanor's wrist, causing her to drop the knife. As Eleanor stumbled, Rachel ran for the front door, but it was locked with multiple deadbolts. Eleanor called out in a sing-song voice, "Margaret, don't run away from Mommy again. Dinner is ready." Rachel ran upstairs, looking for another way out. In Eleanor's bedroom, she found more evidence of the woman's delusion. The room had been converted into a shrine to Margaret, with clothes laid out on the bed and detailed plans for keeping Margaret home permanently. From the bedroom window, Rachel could see into her own house. Eleanor had been watching her every move, learning her routines, collecting her belongings, creating an elaborate fantasy that Rachel was her deceased daughter, who had finally returned home. Rachel managed to break the window and climb onto the roof. From there, she jumped to a neighbor's yard and called police. When officers arrived, they found Eleanor sitting calmly at her dining table, having dinner with an empty chair. She was talking animatedly to the empty seat, serving food as if someone was sitting there. The investigation revealed Eleanor had been suffering from severe dementia, complicated by grief-induced psychosis. She had been watching Rachel's house through telescopes, taking photographs, and breaking into Rachel's home to collect memories for her shrine. Eleanor was placed in a psychiatric facility where she received proper care. Rachel moved out immediately, but later learned the house she'd been renting actually had belonged to Eleanor's daughter Margaret 20 years earlier, before Margaret moved to California and lost touch with her mother. Eleanor had been waiting 2 decades, watching the empty property, hoping her daughter would come home. When Rachel moved in and shared some physical similarities with Margaret, Eleanor's fragile mental state created an elaborate delusion that her prayers had been answered. Rachel now lives in a high-rise apartment where she doesn't worry about neighbors watching through windows. But she still gets nervous whenever someone invites her for dinner. Tom should have trusted his instincts when he found Mr. Garrison sitting in his living room at 3 a.m., calmly reading a book as if he owned the place. But by then, his elderly neighbor had already been helping with household repairs for 2 months, and the house had begun to feel like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Oh, don't mind me," Mr. Garrison had said without looking up from his book. "The house called me over. It's been having trouble sleeping lately." Tom had given Mr. Garrison a spare key weeks earlier, grateful for the help with his constantly failing Victorian house. But the key was still hanging on Tom's kitchen hook, and all the doors had been locked from the inside. It had started innocently enough. Mr. Garrison was a retired handyman who lived next door, always available to help with the endless problems that came with owning a 130-year-old house. Leaky pipes, electrical issues, creaky floorboards. Mr. Garrison fixed them all with impressive skill and never asked for payment. "Houses like this need special attention," Mr. Garrison had explained during his first visit. "They have personalities. You know, needs and wants just like people do." Tom had thought it was a charming way of talking about old architecture. He hadn't realized Mr. Garrison meant it literally. The first sign something was wrong came when Tom started finding evidence of Mr. Garrison's visits even on days when the old man hadn't stopped by. Tools left in different rooms, repair work completed overnight, even meals prepared and waiting on the kitchen counter. "I hope you don't mind," Mr. Garrison said when Tom asked about it. "The house gets lonely when you're at work. I like to keep it company." More disturbing was Mr. Garrison's impossible knowledge of Tom's private life. He would mention Tom's phone conversations, his work problems, even his dreams from the night before. "I heard you talking to your ex-wife again," Mr. Garrison observed during one repair visit. "She wants you to sell this place and move back to the city. But the house doesn't want you to leave. Tom, it's grown quite attached to you." Tom had never told anyone about Sarah's calls, and they had spoken in his bedroom with the door closed. There was no way Mr. Garrison could have overheard. The situation escalated when Tom realized that Mr. Garrison knew things that were happening in real time, even when he wasn't physically present. "You're reading that mystery novel again?" Mr. Garrison mentioned during a phone call. "The one about the detective with the drinking problem? You're on page 127. Tom looked down at his book. He was indeed on page 127, but he was reading in his locked study, and Mr. Garrison was supposedly calling from his own house. That night, Tom decided to test his suspicions. He searched his house thoroughly and found what looked like small recording devices hidden throughout the rooms. But when he examined them closely, they weren't electronic at all. They appeared to be made of some kind of organic material, like dried wood or bone, and they pulsed with a faint warmth when touched. When Tom confronted Mr. Garrison about the devices, the old man's reaction was unsettling. "Oh, those aren't mine," Mr. Garrison said with genuine surprise. "Those belong to the house. It grows them when it wants to keep track of things. I just help it understand what it's hearing. Houses don't grow surveillance devices, don't they?" Mr. Garrison asked. And as he spoke, Tom noticed that the wooden trim around his windows had developed what looked like small knots that resembled eyes. "This house has been alive for over a century, Tom. It's learned how to watch, how to listen, how to remember. I just taught it how to share what it knows." Tom tried to remove the organic devices, but they seemed to be rooted into the walls themselves. When he pulled on one, it released a sound like a pained sigh, and he could swear he felt the entire house shudder. Over the next few days, Tom became increasingly aware that his house was watching him. Floorboards would creak in response to his movements. Doors would open and close on their own. The temperature would shift based on his mood, growing warm when he was content and cold when he was afraid. Most disturbing was the way Mr. Garrison seemed to be in constant communication with the house. Tom would see him standing in his yard, appearing to have conversations with Tom's windows. Sometimes, Tom could hear the old man's voice coming from inside the walls themselves. "The house is worried about you, Tom," Garrison explained during one visit. "You've been thinking about moving again. But where would you go? This house knows you better than anyone ever has. It understands your needs, your fears, your desires. You belong here." Tom realized that Mr. Garrison hadn't just been repairing his house. He had been turning it into some kind of living entity that could monitor and influence its occupants. Every fix had been an enhancement to the house's ability to observe and control. When Tom tried to leave, the house actively resisted. Doors wouldn't open, his car wouldn't start, and he received constant phone calls from numbers that didn't exist, all playing recordings of his own voice, begging him to come home. Tom finally escaped by breaking a window. But even from his hotel room, he could feel the house's influence. His dreams were filled with images of his Victorian home, and he found himself unconsciously driving past the neighborhood, drawn by a pull he couldn't resist. When police investigated Tom's claims, they found Mr. Garrison living alone in his own house, with no evidence of any unusual activity. The organic devices Tom had described were gone, replaced by normal wooden fixtures that showed no signs of tampering. But the officers did note that Tom's house seemed unusually responsive to environmental changes. Lights would flicker when people walked by. The heating system would adjust itself without being programmed, and several officers reported feeling like they were being watched during their investigation. Tom now lives in a modern apartment building, but he still receives occasional messages from his old house. Not phone calls or letters, but direct communications that appear in his mind like memories that aren't his own. Images of Mr. Garrison continuing his repairs, of new tenants moving in and gradually becoming part of the house's extended consciousness. The most recent message was an invitation. "The house misses Tom," it says. "It's learned so much since he left, grown more sophisticated in its ability to care for its occupants. It promises that if he returns, he'll never want to leave again." Tom still has the spare key to his old house. Sometimes, late at night, he finds himself holding it, wondering what it would be like to go home to a place that truly understands him. After all, where else can you find a home that loves you enough to never let you go? Mrs. Henderson knew everything about the Miller family before they even finished unpacking. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma preferred chocolate chip cookies over oatmeal raisin. Their marriage had been struggling for 6 months, and their son Jake had been having nightmares about his dead grandfather every night for the past week. The problem was, the Millers had never told anyone these things. They had just moved into the 2-story craftsman house next door to Mrs. Henderson 3 days ago. "I brought some cookies for Emma," Mrs. Henderson announced on their doorstep, holding a plate of fresh chocolate chip cookies. And I thought little Jake might like this teddy bear. Sometimes a special toy can help with bad dreams. David Miller stared at the elderly woman in confusion. They hadn't mentioned Emma's cookie preferences to any neighbors, and Jake's nightmares were something they had only discussed in whispers after the children were asleep. "How did you know about?" David began. "Oh, you know how sounds carry in these old neighborhoods, Mrs. Henderson said with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind me getting involved, but I just love helping families settle in." But David knew their windows had been closed every night, and Jake's nightmares were silent, except for occasional whimpering that wouldn't carry beyond their own house. Mrs. Henderson quickly became a fixture in their daily routine. She would appear at their door each morning with some small offering. Her timing always perfect, as if she somehow knew exactly when they needed her. "I noticed Sarah's been feeling overwhelmed with the move," Mrs. Henderson mentioned to David one morning. "Perhaps she'd like to join my book club. We're reading a wonderful novel about second chances." David felt his stomach tighten. Sarah had indeed been struggling with the move, but they had only discussed it in their bedroom with the door closed. More unsettling was Mrs. Henderson's knowledge of their most private family moments. "Emma's been asking about getting a dog," she said during another visit. "A golden retriever. Specifically, she's been practicing how to ask you by talking to her stuffed animals." Emma had indeed been rehearsing this conversation, but only in the privacy of her bedroom, speaking quietly to her toys when she thought no one was listening. Sarah began to feel like they were living in a fishbowl. Every private conversation, every family decision seemed to be common knowledge to Mrs. Henderson within hours. "I don't understand how she knows these things," Sarah confided to David one night. "It's like she's living inside our house with us." The next morning, Mrs. Henderson appeared with a concerned expression. "I couldn't help but notice you've been having some concerns about privacy," she said to Sarah. "Sometimes it takes time to adjust to being part of a community that cares about each other." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Their conversation had taken place in their bedroom at midnight, with all curtains drawn and doors closed. David decided to test his suspicions. That evening, he shared a fabricated story with Sarah about considering a job offer in another state, making sure to speak loud enough that someone outside might overhear. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson arrived with a concerned look. "I heard about the job opportunity," she said sympathetically, "but I hope you'll consider how much the children have already adjusted to their new home." David's hands trembled. The job offer was completely fictional, and he had never mentioned it to anyone except Sarah. That night, David searched their house exterior for surveillance equipment. He found several cameras hidden in bushes and window frames, but when he examined the footage, it showed impossible things. The cameras had somehow captured conversations inside their house, with all windows and doors closed. When David confronted Mrs. Henderson about the surveillance, her reaction was chilling. "Oh, those old things," she said dismissively. "I don't really need them anymore. I've gotten much better at understanding what families need without relying on technology. You've been spying on us. I've been caring for you." "Mrs. Henderson corrected gently, "just like I cared for the Johnsons before you, and the Williams family before them. Families need guidance." David, as she spoke, David felt something probing at the edges of his thoughts. Mrs. Henderson's eyes seemed to shimmer slightly, and he found himself struggling to remember why he had been angry. "The previous families were so grateful for my help," Mrs. Henderson continued. "The Johnsons especially. After I got involved, they became the perfect family. Never fought, never disagreed, never wanted to move away." David tried to research the previous families, but found disturbing gaps in the records. The Johnsons had lived there, but there were no forwarding addresses when they moved. No social media presence, no employment records. More concerning, neighbors who mentioned the Johnsons described them identically. "Perfect family," they would say. "Never any problems. Always so happy. They loved living next to Mrs. Henderson." But when David pressed for details, no one could provide any. No specific conversations, no particular events, not even what they looked like. It was as if the family had been reduced to a single, repeated description. David realized that Mrs. Henderson hadn't just been monitoring families. She had been reshaping them, molding them into her ideal by getting inside their minds. Over the next few days, David watched in horror as his family began to change. Sarah stopped complaining about the move and started speaking in vague, contented terms about how perfect their new life was. The children became unnaturally well-behaved, never fighting or asking for anything beyond what Mrs. Henderson deemed appropriate. Most disturbing, they all began to speak about Mrs. Henderson with grateful, loving tones. David tried to take his family away for a weekend, but they resisted leaving. Sarah insisted they couldn't abandon Mrs. Henderson when she had been so helpful. The children cried at the thought of being away from their grandmother. When David packed them into the car by force, they made it only 3 blocks before Sarah demanded he turn around. The children started screaming that they needed to go home to Mrs. Henderson. Even David felt an overwhelming compulsion to return, as if invisible strings were pulling him back. Now, as David writes this account, he can feel Mrs. Henderson's influence growing stronger in his mind. His family sits contentedly in the living room, discussing how grateful they are to have such a caring neighbor. They no longer remember feeling monitored or uncomfortable. David knows he's running out of time. Soon, he'll forget why he was ever concerned. He'll start thinking of her as a beloved family member, someone who only wants what's best for them. The thought isn't entirely unpleasant. Mrs.
Henderson promises that once he stops fighting,
his family will be truly happy. No more arguments, no more stress, no more uncertainty, just perfect contentment under her loving guidance. After all, what could be wrong with a neighbor who cares enough to help your family become everything they were meant to be?